I'm going to just quickly show you again all of our opening screens. These are the various ways we offer the public the ability to be a student with us, from listening to our free weekly podcast, to our Astro Library, to our multimedia course. And so when you're watching this as a recording, if you want more information, you always have the ability to freeze your screen when you're watching recordings. And so here's a little bit more detail in regards to our Astro Library. We have 3 different sections. As you can see, we have a fair amount of titles and hours that you can pursue all kinds of evolutionary astrology topics. We have dozens of evolutionary astrologers here, including our presenter this morning, Scott Wolfram. And so then one more screen for you. Here is EAN's multimedia course. This is what I, Kim Marie, have done over the years. For those of you who are not familiar with it or do not remember my chart from yesterday, I didn't show you the houses. I have 7 of my 10 planetary archetypes in either Sagittarius or the 9th house. So when it comes to evolutionary astrology, what else would I do but teach? So these are the different segments that we have, and just a little tidbit for you, we will be starting webinar classes on segment 2 here at the beginning of the year. So anybody who has not purchased segment 2, you might want to get your DVDs, get started. We're going to start into some detail. We're going to follow the homework of segment 2 throughout the course of 2014 to help people actually work with the homework and get certifications in segment 2. Now, with that, I'd like to have Leroy turn the screen over to our presenter this morning. I'd like to introduce you to Scott Wolfram from Germany. Welcome, Scott.
Hi, Kim Marie. Hello, everybody.
Scott's topic this morning is going to be on the Grand Cross of 2014 and the evolution of structural reform, and I can read it right off your screen. I really appreciate that. Scott, one of the things we've been doing as I turn it over to you is we have been asking our presenters to give just a little bit of background on them. So if you would be willing to do that, I would appreciate that. And I'm hearing a little background noise. Are you, Leroy?
Yeah, that's Lydia. Lydia, can you make sure you mute yourself, please? I guess I can do that. There you go. Thanks,
All right,
Lydia.
there we go. All right, good. All right, Mr. Scott, take it away, honey. Welcome.
Well, hey, thanks, Kim Marie. Thanks, Leroy. And hello, everyone. Yeah, my name's Scott Wolfram, and I'm calling through the lovely opportunity that we have through the internet. I'm in Munich, Germany. I'm wearing my Bavarian vest today, which can also double as a Hobbit outfit if I wanted it to. And in terms of me, you know, Kim, I was, I think, your first graduate.
Yes, you were. Oh, that's
you know,
right.
and so that was so this is one of these lovely little connections. And what I have done is taken evolutionary astrology and wrapped it in the language of myth. And so I look at all of the evolutionary all of the themes of evolutionary astrology from the mythic perspective. And then I also connected with astrology of location. So as an example, one of my best places in the world where my past life karma and my dharma for this lifetime take place is right here in Munich, Germany. And we've been here for 3.5 years, and many lovely things have happened since then. And so, is it anything else that you want to know about me for today, or is that
that's
do
perfect. That's perfect. Thank you. I'm going to take my webcam off now so everybody can concentrate on you. And thank you very much for doing this with us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. Okay, so our topic today is the Grand Cross of 2014 and the evolution of structural reform. And I'm going to be talking today, let me see, get this There we go. I'm going to be chatting today in my material for about 75 minutes. Be prepared to take questions at the end. Well, when we think about this Grand Cross, which will take place next April, there has been a lot of stuff going on that is buzzing in the world right now, but has actually also been taking place since a few years earlier. And I am having a, let's see if this is working here. There we go. Since 2010, when there was a wonderful T-square. And I first wrote about this T-square, and I called it, it was in the summer of 2010, and I called this Evolutionary Structural Reform. And it had all the powerhouses of the zodiac. It had Saturn conjunct Mars in Libra, opposing Uranus and Jupiter in Aries, and all being squared by Pluto. And so what has happened over the last few years is that this square between Uranus and Pluto has continued to evolve, and now we have the Grand Cross coming up here in early 2014, when Jupiter will have moved on to oppose Pluto, and Mars will be opposing Uranus and creating this Grand Cross. And really what's been happening, and the reason I've been so interested and quite frankly really excited about this topic, is that whether it's in the news of all the changes and the issue of structural reform that's going on in the world around us, or whether it's been in the conversations I have with people every day about what's going on in their lives, or in my personal chart, because I have the sun at 11 degrees of Cancer. So right now, as we speak, Uranus is squaring my sun and Pluto is squaring my sun. So I've been living this. And really what this means is that from my chart to the charts of the people I chat with, things are happening on a personal level. And yet, at the same time, things are also happening on a social level. So what we want to do is to recognize that what we're really moving from is, in 2010, the intention was was evolutionary structural reform. And as we move forward through the years and into 2014, it will be the evolution of that structural reform. So let's back up for just a second and begin by taking a look at the process of what structural reform means. First, there is a demand within the concept of structural reform to embrace meaningful change, meaningful transformation. Second, there is an ongoing unfolding process that takes time and takes place over time. The reason for this is that the aspect, this square between Uranus and Pluto, this square is going to hang around for at least 5 years, maybe a little bit longer than that. At this point in time, it's been around for 3 years, and it's going to be around for a couple more years. So these aspects take time for them to unfold. And finally, the last piece is that the outcomes are yet to be determined, meaning that as we look at the evolution of structural reform, that we haven't seen all of the impacts, all of the outcomes, either in the social world or in our personal lives. And what we're going to do over the course of the next 70 minutes or so is we're going to be exploring this Grand Cross through the mix of astrology, mythology, and history. And we're going to really try to uncover the key insights about how to go about embracing structural reform for ourselves and understanding what's happening in the world around us. When I turn on the news every day, and because here I'm in Munich, we don't have every TV channel, but we get CNBC, which is the business or stock market television channel. And just about every day when I turn it on, they're talking about the concept of structural reform. Structural reform in terms of the US banking system, structural reform in terms of the Eurozone monetary crisis. Well, there's another example, and the screen that we have up is that the Arab Spring has been taking place for the last few years, in which Arab states are in the process of reforming their social structures from being ruled by a king or a monarchy of one kind, or maybe a dictator, generally a military dictator, and moving it into some direction toward democracy. And when we take a look at Egypt, we can see how this process is still ongoing and that the outcome is still unknown. We don't know what's going to happen here. And we begin with Egypt in that there was a revolution. On January 25th of 2011, people took to the streets, started a revolution, and on February 11th, 2011, about, what would that be, about 17 days later, the president, Hosni Mubarak, was thrown out of office. This is revolution number one. Reform number one then comes and follows that, and that there's a democratic election, and there's a new president, Mohamed Morsi, and they form a new Egyptian constitution. Well, in this case, the process isn't done because we have a second revolution. And on July 3rd, 2013, the Morsi government is overthrown in a combination of a popular uprising and a military coup. And now we have a new step of reform in that there's a caretaker government that's been put in place. And since that time, we have had a new potential revolution taking place. We don't know yet what the outcomes will be, but there have been protests by people connected with the political party called the Muslim Brotherhood. Well, what's really important here when we think about the entirety of this process is that the objective was structural reform. And in Egypt, this is not complete. It's still evolving. And really what this demonstrates is a couple of key points. That first, the structural reform has the need for meaningful change. Second, that the structural reform is an ongoing process. And third, that the outcomes are yet to be determined. And what we're going to do is we'll have to wait and see what happens in Egypt. But what we will do a little bit later is we're going to take a look at the United States and the history of the United States, and we're going to explore structural reform from a different context, in a larger context. But first, let's explore and come back to the Grand Cross of 2014. And what we have is once again, we have Jupiter in Cancer opposing Pluto in Capricorn, and Mars in Aries opposing Uranus in Aries. But really, what we're going to do is we're going to let go of Jupiter and Mars for a time. Because at the core of both the great T-square of 2010 and of the Grand Cross of 2014 is this square of Uranus and Pluto. And so what we're going to do is turn our attention and explore these two planets. And what I'd like to do is to begin by exploring Pluto. And we're going to look at Pluto from the context of his place in myth. And he is the god of Hades. He's the ruler of Hades. And what happens is Hades is this land, and one of the things that we have to do when we are trying to get into Hades is we have to cross a number of rivers. One of these rivers is called the River Lethe, which literally means forgetfulness or concealment. Souls drink from the River Lethe as they cross it. They experience forgetfulness and an inability to remember their past lives. Well, for Pluto, when we think about this in the astrological realm of Pluto, Pluto, Scorpio, and the eighth house are also connected with the deep secrets that are concealed or that are forgotten. So this is the first thing we want to remember, is that there's something about Pluto and his realm and his world that's hard for us to experience it. The second thing is, and this is at the top, is that Pluto wears a helmet of invisibility. So here we have, he puts on this helmet, he can go into the world and he can't be seen. One of the things Pluto. First, Ceres and a wonderful god Jupiter, and she's meant to take her role. And this is where Pluto comes in, because Pluto has a role. Pluto wants us to take our rightful place, and Pluto abducts Persephone so that he can make her a queen, because Persephone is meant to be a queen. So, in the end, yes, Pluto pops out of the ground. He's wearing the helmet of invisibility. Nobody can see him. And he abducts Persephone and he ruthlessly takes her to Hades. But what he's doing is he's enforcing her dharma. She's meant to be a queen. Let's turn the tables. He's meant to do the same thing for us. Pluto wants us to take our rightful place. So we recognize all of these qualities of Pluto. He wants us to take our place, and yet it's hard to see and understand what he really wants of us. And generally, once again, as in transits, he tends to wear the helmet of invisibility that makes it hard to see him. Well, when we turn our attention to Uranus, we know from astrology he's the great awakener. He wants to liberate us. He wants to move us forward. He wants us to become more authentic. All of these fabulous words that push us forward: liberation, awakening, becoming more authentic, becoming creative. Well, in myth, we really don't have a lot of images of Uranus. So when we think about these two planets together, Pluto wears the helmet of invisibility, and we have no real idea what Uranus looks like. And so the question comes and it says, well, what does the combination of Pluto and Uranus look like? Well, I'm going to make a proposal today. Yes, indeed. This is Chewbacca, the great Wookiee of Star Wars. And, if you don't know Star Wars, he's a big fuzzy character. He's like 6'8" tall. He doesn't speak really. He grunts, he growls, he gestures wildly. I know one thing: whenever I see the Wookiee Chewbacca in Star Wars, I have no idea what he's saying. And yet, this is sometimes the way Uranus and Pluto feel. Like we know that these two are taking part in our lives, and at the same time we don't really always know exactly what they want from us. So when he's grunting, when he's pointing at something, when he's being very dramatic and gesturing, something is up and something is big. When we experience Uranus and Pluto in our lives, something is up, something is big. And what we can first try to do is to try to pay attention to what he's pointing at. And at the same time, there's another message. And what I want to do is, when we look into Star Wars, here we have another moment from the movie, and here the Wookiee is playing chess with one of the robots. He's a droid. And the droid is winning. And the hero sitting off to the side, we can't see him, but Han Solo says to the Wookiee, he says to the droid, excuse me, he says, you know, I think you better let the Wookiee win. And the droid says, well, why should I let the Wookiee win? I'm winning because I'm smarter than he is. And the response is, you know, Wookiees get angry. And when they get angry, they'll rip your arms off. And so one of the things that happens here is that as people are calling me and I'm chatting with people, they're feeling the pressure and the gestures of the Wookiee, of Uranus and Pluto. And some of them have said to me, literally, Uranus and Pluto have ripped my arms off. And I know that's kind of gross and it's really direct, but this is what these two people, Uranus and Pluto, act like. They act like the Wookiee. So let's back up for a second and remember that Uranus and Pluto both want to be your friends. They're trying to help us to let go of what's holding us back so we can become who we're meant to be, more authentic, more potent, reborn, re-energized, all those great words. When the Wookiee is gesturing in our lives or threatening something in our lives, they're telling us that the same old doesn't work with the Wookiee. If we resist these powerhouses, they might rip our arms off. So when we think about this combination, one thing that we want to do is to let the Wookiee win. We want to do what the Wookiee wants because he is going to make it happen whether we want to or not. Whether it's the droid or whether it's Persephone, Pluto and Uranus are going to get what they want. So, we still don't know a whole lot about what we can do to understand what this means. So what I'd like to do is to go back in time and take a look at the United States in history and the concept of structural reform as it's gone on throughout U.S. history. One of the really neat things as we're going to do this is that Uranus and Pluto, through conjunctions, squares, and oppositions, they have cycles. And we're going to go back in time and explore some of these moments. Now, why the U.S.? Well, number one, the U.S. was founded right before Uranus was discovered. So we are looking at the Declaration of Independence, 1776, and in 1781 we have the discovery of Uranus. So it's a pretty good example. Now today, I just want to say that I'm only going to explore a few events. And this is not because other events aren't important or meaningful, but I'm really going to focus in on the ones that will help us understand the role of Uranus and Pluto. They'll help us to understand what some of the grunts and gestures of the Wookiee are trying to get at. So what I want to just make a note here as we're looking at this Declaration of Independence is that, in a sense, this was the United States version number one, version 1.0 in sort of the modern world terms. We have software and it always comes out in versions. It's 1.0. This was the founding documents. And one of the keys, there are a couple of different themes running through the Declaration and the Constitution and so on, and I'm going to look at two of them today. And again, there are others as well, but I'm going to look at two. One is the notion that in terms of a democracy, that all men are created equal. Second, that a democracy would also have a system of free market capitalism and success via the markets. Now, when I see these two ideas as being different perspectives that are embedded in the DNA of the United States and also in the birth chart of the United States. The times when Uranus and Pluto are conjunct, square, or oppose will help reveal times when the unfolding of the nation demands structural reform. What we're going to do is we're going to begin going through the history of the nation and moving beyond these founding documents and see how evolutionary structural reform takes place. Here we have a chart from 1850, and Uranus and Pluto are conjunct at 29 degrees of Aries. And it was an interesting time because a year later in 1851 there was this huge stellium of energy in the sign of Taurus, where Saturn and where Pluto and Uranus moved into Taurus, but they were joined by Saturn, Mars, Venus, and Mercury all at one time. So there was a lot of power around the notion of structural reform during this time. What happened in 1850? There was a big debate. The United States was pushing west, and as their new states were being added, a question was being asked, what should we do with regard to slavery as we go to the west? Well, the nation was struggling with this from the very beginning. In the very first version of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson was going to outlaw the slave trade. But it was shot down. It was deferred. So now that theme that was underpinning the foundations of the nation, it's being tested. And in 1850, they came up with a compromise. Now, we don't need to know all the details of the compromise, but what it really did was it kept open the notion of slavery as being potentially legal. So the effort at structural reform did some things, but it didn't solve the question. What happens when that takes place? We have this question, Compromise of 1850 over slavery. We look forward into the future, and we have in 1861 the beginning of the Civil War. Lasts till 1865. It is a war over the issue, basically, of slavery. Now, what happens is that Uranus and Pluto are no longer in a conjunction. They are one full sign apart. Uranus is at 9 degrees of Gemini, and Pluto is at 8 degrees of Taurus. But what we do have is a really interesting conjunction. Transiting Uranus is conjunct natal Uranus. This is the Uranus return. It happens every 84 years. So basically, the Civil War began 84 years after the founding of the nation. And in this case, there is a question. Uranus is this planet that wants the world to move forward. And the question that was on the table in 1850 was, what are we going to do about slavery? And the effect was that they didn't settle it, so the Uranus return became the astrological trigger that started the Civil War. Interestingly, the planet Mars is conjunct Uranus at 6 and 9 degrees of Gemini to start the war. So not only do we have a Uranus return, but then we have the planet Mars, the planet of war, energizing this change. So what does this mean? It means that the ultimate goal embedded in the DNA of the United States was the end of slavery. The result could not be avoided. The Wookiee, Uranus, and Pluto would demand it. The Compromise of 1850 was an ineffective reform. Therefore, there was a cataclysm, a big war that took place at this other transit. What's the outcome? Now we have the United States version 2.0, because now all men were equal. Well, once again, at least in theory. So let's now move forward in time to 1930. And here's April 30, 1930, and Uranus is in Aries, squaring Pluto in Cancer. And here we have another opportunity at structural reform, but now we have a different context. The United States in the previous decade had just seen an enormous growth of wealth. We had the Roaring Twenties, where there was a lot of money made in the financial markets. And at the same time, there were some imbalances that took place, which led to the stock market crash in October of 1929, which led to the failure of 11,000 banks. Now, in the US at that time, there were around 25,000 banks. So 11 out of every 25 banks, almost half of the banks in the United States, failed during that time. This is what we would call a systemic crisis. And it all happened during the time when Pluto and Uranus were square to one another. At this time, the United States took some action. They said, how can we correct some of those imbalances? Well, they did a bunch of things, but two things that they, oh, excuse me, I forgot. We also had after that the Great Depression. So we have the Roaring Twenties leading to the stock market crash, leading to the bank failures that led into the Great Depression. What was the structural reform that was taken at this time? The first is an act, 1933. This is not the actual name of the act. It was a banking reform act, but it was known by two of the guys that were involved with it. Their names were Glass and Steagall. And what Glass-Steagall did was create new rules for banks so that banks would become safer, so that the financial system of the country would not be systemically challenged. Second, Social Security Act was created in 1935. The idea here was that if the markets create such uncertainty, the Social Security Act would create a bit of security for our elders, for those who are prepared to retire. One quick note is that this reform of Glass-Steagall was very effective. There were no major bank failures, no bank failures that we would call threatening the system until the act gets repealed. We'll talk about that later. But one of the key things that we want to be aware of is that, once again, the reforms took place later on, after the transit has really hit its crescendo and has moved on a bit. So, the outcome, structural reform, we have a new banking system, we have a new way of helping society. This is the United States 3.0. Well, let's go forward one more step in time. And this is a chart from February 23rd of 1966, where Pluto and Uranus are conjunct. They hadn't been conjunct, by the way, since the Compromise of 1850. So here we have this long period of time, 111 years, and Uranus and Pluto are again conjunct. And this time they are opposed by Saturn, and at this particular time also Mars and Mercury. Well, it's interesting that this was the decade in which we experienced the civil rights movement in the United States. And so there was this question. in the Declaration of Independence, all men were legal, at least in theory. The civil rights movement was an attempt to make that more real, to bring it into reality in a more full way. During this time, there were a couple of reforms. Number one, there was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and there was the Voting Rights Act of 1965, both that were there as remedies to try to make it so that the structural reform in the United States was the next step in the notion of all men being created equal. This is, in a sense, the US 4.0. Well, let's move forward now to structural reform revisited. And what we're doing now is bringing together a couple of notes. I'm putting up the image of the Grand Cross of 2014, but I want to make a couple notes. In 1999, key elements of the Glass-Steagall regulations were repealed. So some of those banking rules that were put in after the Great Depression and after all the bank failures, they were taken out. This led to a major banking crisis in 2008. For the first time since the Great Depression, there was a systemic risk to the United States' banking system. So we want to think about this in two ways as we're thinking about Uranus and Pluto. The reforms of 1933 were effective. We took them down in 1999, and we had another crisis in 2008. Now, one of the things that's important to know at this time is that when the banking crisis took place, Uranus and Pluto were 8 degrees away from the square of 2010. So they were totally out of orb. This all took place, the crisis took place before Uranus and Pluto. So just be aware that, again, sometimes the crises occur before the event of the astrological event, before the transit, sometimes during, sometimes after. They happen at all different kinds of times. And interestingly, as we mentioned earlier, the outcome of the U.S. banking system is still unresolved. We really don't know. Will we have a return of some form of Glass-Steagall? In fact, it's really interesting. The former head of Citigroup said the other day, he actually said this also about a year ago, but he said it again this last week. He said, I think Glass-Steagall maybe should come back. We should separate banks into banking and investment, which is really what Glass-Steagall did. Well, the other thing we could do is we could have less regulation. We don't know what's going to happen yet. What will it look like? We really don't know. Because we've had this crisis over banking, it's also interesting to note that in 2013, the Supreme Court struck down important elements of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. They were overturned. We have a question that comes from this, which is, when Glass-Steagall was repealed, there was a great crisis in the banking system 8 years later. Now we've struck down key elements of the Voting Rights Act. What will the outcomes be? Again, we don't know. One of the key thoughts that I think is, I ask the question, what will the United States 5.0 look like? We don't really know. One of the key times, when do I think we're going to certainly have a big test? Pluto will conjunct Pluto, meaning transiting Pluto will conjunct the US Pluto in 2022. It will be the Pluto return. So that's one of the key times when I think we're going to see this tested. Well, let's do a summary here of this exploration of the US. As our whole time today, Uranus and Pluto are the demand for evolutionary structural reform. The crises can occur before the transit, during the transit, after the transit, or maybe not at all. The outcomes are not always realized during the transit. Crises are often triggered by other transits, just like they were in the Civil War. Will they be triggered again in 2022? By the way, I'm not predicting a great calamity, but I'm saying this is one of the times when we would be tested. Here's one of the big keys. Effective reform can result in avoiding our crises. And finally, the structural reform needs to support the themes that are in the birth chart. So when we look at the United States, if the intention is to support the unfolding of the birth chart, this structural reform, Uranus and Pluto, what is the meaning of all men are created equal? What is the role of free markets in a democracy? These are the questions being asked. Well, how can we explore these? How can we see more clearly? What we're going to do now is explore some of the challenges to the idea of structural reform. And there's this guy, Jared Diamond, great author. You probably know that he did Germs, Guns, and Steel, but he also wrote a book called Collapse. And in the book Collapse, Jared Diamond really focuses on two words, two concepts. And the concepts are collapse and why. These are both Pluto words. Pluto enforces the demand for change when we avoid or resist it, and collapse is the metaphor or the outcome that is the worst outcome in the wake of Pluto's efforts. Collapse occurs when we resist the need for reform. In 1850, the compromise was failed. It led to the Civil War. It's not the only possible outcome. Glass-Steagall worked. We could have made different choices. So what we have to do is overcome the challenges. And what's the first major issue? First, collapse is the result of resisting the demand for evolutionary structural reform. The first challenge is, and this is from Jared Diamond, is the failure to perceive the problem. Now, of course, there's problems out there, but it's sometimes hard to tell what they are. So the Wookiee, Uranus and Pluto, can be howling to us and waving our arms, but we don't always know what they're pointing at. So what Jared Diamond said was an interesting theme. First, sometimes change is gradual, and it leads to this notion of landscape amnesia and not recognizing the degree to which things have changed. In a sense, long-term change can get overshadowed by the fact that we have all kinds of little changes day by day, and we can't see the long-term consequences. So as an example, in the US, why not repeal Glass-Steagall? People said, we haven't had a bank failure in over 75 years. We don't have a problem with bank failures. We had landscape amnesia. We couldn't remember that there was such a thing as a really big bank failure. What about global warming? Here's another version. Today, tomorrow, the next day, temperatures go up, temperatures go down. Sometimes temperatures are swinging 20, 30 degrees. And in our memories, some people say, we've always had extremes in weather. I remember it's no different from my childhood. Well, when people think this, they're missing the problem because they're seeing changes and they say, well, we've always had ups and downs. But what's the real problem of climate change and global warming? Well, here in the Alps, Munich is about 90 minutes north of the Alps by a train. And here, the Alps are shrinking every year. The glaciers in the Alps, the mountains are still there, but the glaciers are shrinking every year. They just put out a new study. And there's two interesting studies that have come out here in Germany. One is how much higher they're going to have to raise the ski emporiums where people go skiing because they're not going to be able to have enough snow, and they're planning ahead because they know 20 years from now at the current rate they won't be able to have skiing where they do today. Climate change is real. Second, I just saw 2 days ago a story on that talks about the fact that Germany makes a lot of wine today. But what they're really preparing for is that as temperatures go up, that the wine growing region might migrate from Italy north to Germany. And so Germany is now promoting more wine growing. So it's an interesting thing. That is the problem. Things are changing, but many people can't see it. In our life, your life and mine, as we sit back and think about our life, some people say, you know, I've been in the same job for so long, it's really hard for me to recognize how much I have grown, how many skills I've developed, how much I've grown as a human being. So we say, I haven't changed, I don't know where I should be going. I don't know what I'm meant to do. Other people say, I've changed jobs so many times, I don't really know what my path is. All I do is keep changing. But the little changes that keep happening get lost, and it's hard to see what the big picture is. Well, we want to know that this is our first challenge. The second challenge is allowing for special interests to block the solution. So, you know, as an example, one of the things that we can do we know that we're going to try to understand the problem, but now we have this new problem, which is different people have different priorities. We can, as an example, we could say when we think about the political side, we could say some people don't believe in global warming and might try to block legislation that would fix that. Some people say, I really want to have open markets so that people can make money quickly, and they might block the solution to the bigger problem. So this is one of the real keys here. How can we make sure that we are paying attention to the key themes here? Go back to Egypt. Is Egypt a secular democracy or an Islamic democracy? Or will they lose democracy altogether and end up back with a military dictatorship? So here we have this, and this is what goes on in societies. We can see that happening as we watch the news. In our personal lives, though, we might say, I know I meant to do something different, but I still want this other stuff, and I'm not really willing to let go of that. I love the security of my current job. I can't imagine accepting the insecurity of doing something new, even though I know I meant to do it. I love the money that I'm making today. I don't think I could accept a lower standard of living. I love my big house. I'm not sure that I could downsize my life and my belongings. So these are examples of our internal questions about structural reform. And what we want to be able to do is to ask a question. And what we want to do is to ask, with these 2 points, the failure to perceive the problem and the allowing of our small interests to block the big solution, personally we would say, what do I need to do so I can live my dream? So I can feel great every morning when I get up, when I can feel vibrant. That's what we want to do. The intention here is that evolutionary structural reform promotes the goals that honor our soul's journey. Specific interests are our old habits and our daily comforts that get in the way of that. So what can we do, though? The rebirth is the result of embracing structural reform. We have the potential for rebirth. So one of the things that we can do, if in terms of the Wookiee, we can pay attention to what the Wookiee is doing. As an example, if there's a certain area of our life that is under stress, if things aren't going the way we had hoped that they would be going. These are the places where we're meant to pay attention to the Wookiee. Second, we have the ability to make new choices and accept trade-offs. So think of all the trade-offs, but think about them in this regard. We say, if I could live the life I've always dreamed of, if I could do the thing that would make me feel really rich and rewarded, what would I trade for that? One of the interesting notes is, since Uranus and Pluto work slowly over time, you have the time to plan a transition program. You can say, I want to do this. It'll take a couple of years. I think in general, Uranus and Pluto are quite okay with that. So one of the keys here is that what we're going to do is ask these questions. And the final piece that is really key is this. When we think about this, each of us individually is meant to make our own choices. When we say, who is the one that is the final arbitrator? Is it our family? Is it family expectations? Is it social expectations? Is it keeping up with the Joneses? Is it our religious leaders? Or is it you? My feeling is that each of us has this potential within us. And finally, we are not fated to failing these challenges. So what we're going to do now is we've looked at the process of structural reform. We've looked at the challenges to structural reform. We have some way of thinking about how we can mitigate those challenges. Now let's talk about the Grand Cross of 2014. And let's look at this Grand Cross. And what we're going to do now is we're now going to take out Uranus and Pluto. You know, when we think about this, and I'm actually going to just stop for a second and let me just actually put these back. What is a Grand Cross? It is a great amount of tension with a great amount of opportunity. As a quick little historic back note to this, when the Freemasons founded their Grand Lodge in 1717, they elected a chart that was a square. Jupiter was conjunct the Sun in Cancer, and it was square to Saturn in Libra. They chose a chart with a square because the square was great opportunity. Now, it's an interesting thing. At that time, Jupiter and Saturn were the most powerful, most distant planets that were known. We have to go back and remember the other planets, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, they weren't known that yet. Uranus wasn't discovered until 1781. So this square of Saturn with Jupiter and the Sun was the most powerful thing they could think of. When the United States was founded with the Declaration of Independence, they elected a chart with Jupiter conjunct the Sun, square the Saturn in Libra. It was pretty much the same chart. And in fact, it was 2 Saturn cycles and 5 Jupiter cycles was the time frame when the Declaration of Independence came after the foundation of the Grand Lodge. So in 2 Saturn cycles are basically 59 years. 5 Jupiter cycles are slightly less than 60. Pluto rules Hades. Uranus rules the skies in one regard or another, but there are other gods and other planets that have their own unique roles to play. And what I want to do is talk about the role of Jupiter. And the most important role for Jupiter is that the messages from Jupiter are ones that can be recognized. In what? We get opportunities. We get visions and we can see them. This is sort of the same thing when we look into the sky. We can see Jupiter with our unaided eyes from the Earth. We can see his messages when they come in opportunities and visions. This is totally unlike the grunts that come from the Wookiee. We can catch the messages of Jupiter. The next thing, and this is almost more important, the role of Jupiter is that he has 12-year cycles. And these, in a sense, often reveal the evolution of the chapters of our lives. One of the things that can really be helpful is to understand that the journey of the soul is a progression of cycles in which we are unfolding the themes that are at the heart of our birth chart. One thing that we can do that can be really helpful is to look back 12 years and 12 years further. Now, some of this gets easier as you get a little bit older. It's one of the benefits of being, like in my case, I'm 56. I'm a little bit older at this point, and I can look back to these various cycles and recognize the opportunities that I had in 1989 and in 2001. And in my case, 1989, I met my wife. We had some success. We moved out of the city that we were in, Milwaukee, where I was born, and we moved to Los Angeles, and it totally opened up our life. 12 years later in 2001, two things happened. I formally said I'm going to do astrology full-time and started that process, but I also, this was the time when Sappho and I, my wife, we started traveling to Europe, exploring the myth, seeing our world being expanded even further. Look to the cycles of Jupiter, look to the chapters of your life. So the transits of Jupiter are always connected to the next vision, the next opportunity. Now, in this case, when we look back to these cycles, look to times when Jupiter is conjunct the Sun, the ascendant, Uranus, and also Jupiter, and watch for the opportunities and look to piece and stitch a story together that reveals the way that your life has been unfolding. This is one of the ways to use this Jupiter. The other one is to note that we have opportunities that come right now. And when we embrace the opportunities of Jupiter, they tend to lead us forward. In fact, when I chat with my clients and people on all aspects of their life as they're going on, when they can identify their inspiration, when they understand how their chapters of life are evolving, they understand more than the grunts and groans of the Wookiee, because Jupiter helps them to do that. So when the next opportunity of Jupiter arrives, they recognize Jupiter's message and they take action to bring that into reality one step at a time. Well, let's take this to the next level. What is Jupiter? And if we look at the symbol of Jupiter, what we see is that we have a cross with a lightning bolt coming down from the heavens. Again, in myth, Jupiter is sitting on Mount Olympus, and he sends his vision to us in a lightning bolt coming down from Mount Olympus. When we get that lightning bolt, it comes to us, and yet the lightning bolt needs action to bring that into reality. So one of the things that happens is that the lightning bolt is still sitting up in the air. It hasn't come down into the ground yet, hasn't come down into reality. One of the things that we want to remember is that A, we have to take action to bring this to, well, first, experience and recognize the vision. Second, to know that we need to take action. One of the connections and themes that is part of evolutionary astrology is that there's an archetype, Jupiter, Sagittarius, and the ninth house. And Sagittarius as an element is called mutable fire. Fire is the inspiration. Mutable means it changes. It doesn't stay around if we don't take action on it. The opportunity will fade away. What this does, this need for action will point our attention to Mars. So Mars plays, in my mind, an integral role in the Grand Cross, and in particular, because while, of course, Mars is opposing Uranus, what I really like about this is Mars is square to Jupiter. This is one of the best transits for energizing action. So what we have is the opportunity with this Grand Cross. The first thing that we have the opportunity to do is to initiate action. And one of the keys to this is the concept that take the first step. One of the things that we need to recognize is that when we're still working on a many-year process, we don't have to take action in April of 2014 and be done by May. No, it doesn't really work that way. This energy allows us to initiate action, to take the first step, and there will be more actions that will come after that. In particular, though, one of the threads that links Pluto in this Grand Cross is that Pluto is both the demand for radical change, for transformation, and also the resistance to that change. And the Grand Cross emphasizes and heightens both the opportunity and the resistance. Just like the Grand Lodge and of the Freemasons, just like the United States chart, that when we have a big cross, when we have a lot of squares and oppositions, we have both tension and opportunity. So one of the other reasons to use Mars is that Mars allows us an opportunity to break through old levels of resistance. Over and over, I hear people say, I would love to do this. I'm just afraid to do it. I don't know when to do it. This is a great time to do it. This is a great time to take action. Be courageous. Be confident. This is the noble version of Mars. You know, Mars in myth is kind of a clod. He's kind of a brute. But in our world, you know, astrologically, this Mars energy is connected with the first house, which is a noble house. It's a young house. It's a young energy. But when we are courageous and when we are confident and when we are guided by higher forces like the visions of Jupiter, we can be confident and take action and be successful. So when we combine an awareness of the opportunities of our future that lead us to understand the next chapter of our lives, that allow us to break through the old resistance by taking the first step, be courageous, be confident. Well, this is a slide of Saturn, and below him is collapse, a whole bunch of stuff in ruin. And you might wonder, why am I showing Saturn? Well, Saturn was an integral part of the Grand Cross, the Great T-Square of 2010. But Saturn is not a part of the Grand Cross of 2014. The Saturn elements, resistance, fear, guilt, suppression, all that stuff, they're not really a part of this. The fact that Saturn is not a part of this T-square, this Grand Cross, is a major, major opportunity. It's really a cool thing. So here we've gone through and looked at many things. Let's pull all of this together. The Grand Cross it is a continuation of structural reform. It is the continuing unfolding of the evolution of structural reform. We're in no hurry. Structural reform takes place over time. We get the permission to go one step at a time. Structural reform is designed to support the next chapter of our soul's journey. Now, while it's true the Wookiee is both demanding and hard to understand that Jupiter, through his transits and through his individual transits and longer-term cycles, can help us understand the chapters of our life and how we're meant to unfold. Today's transits of Jupiter can help us identify new opportunities, new visions. He comes around often. He's here to keep giving us ideas. Mars is the catalyst of action. Be courageous, be confident, choose the reform that each of us is meant to make, each in our own unique ways. Well, when we think and look at the Grand Cross that will show up here next year, we're looking at an opportunity when we can choose structural reform and in our own lives and really embrace our own journey in a wonderful new chapter, a more vibrant chapter. And so thank you so much for listening, and I'd love to take any questions that are out there.
Thank you, Scott. As I wait to see if we have anybody in the audience who would like to ask a question, I just want to compliment you. That is just absolutely wonderful. I was sitting here just taking notes all over the place. That was a beautiful, beautiful talk. I think I probably speak for everybody. Yes, I'm starting to get some written comments from people that are really, really enjoying this. So does anybody want to have any, does anybody have comments? Okay, hold on. I've got
Kim, I have a suggestion. While people are getting their questions in for Scott to finish the presentation today, I'd like to launch a quick poll while Scott also gets up on his screen, maybe his promotional slide with his website and telephone numbers, etc. I'll go ahead and launch this poll that Scott might appreciate more than most because it's kind of a trick question.
All right.
You know, Scott does a lot of relocation astrology, as he kind of referred to earlier in his talk today, which kind of found him in a sacred place called Munich, Germany. So why don't everybody take a little moment to select their knowledge of the founding pioneer of astrocartography? Who would that be?
And Terry Z, I see that you have your hand raised. I will unmute you, Terry Z, when we get to questions after the poll.
Sure, and I think it's fine, Kim, if you want to unmute Terry. And while everybody's completing their vote, 3 out of 5 have voted so far. We'll give another 20, 30 seconds for everybody to get their vote in, and then we'll show some results here. I guess might be okay to wait. Let's see.
Terry Z, I think I have you unmuted, honey. Oh, no, wait a minute. I took your question away. Terry, you are unmuted.
Okay. I just wanted to say I took 6 pages of notes. And just a wonderful talk, and thank you so much. I really appreciate this, Scott. Just really appreciate you a lot. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for your comments. It means the world to me.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Jim Lewis is the founding pioneer of astrocartography. I think there's a Continuum website, is there not, that kind of represents his work as it exists today? Scott, can you?
Yeah, Leroy, there is. And actually, on the screen, if you go to my website, which is travelerswell.com, in the back section, there is a section for articles and links. And in that links section, which is a little bit of a ways down, you guys are there, but also there is a link to Continuum. And there's lots of good articles, including a couple from me. So that's one of the probably the best place to get a sense of Jim Lewis's work, which is fabulous.
I have a question from Judy Dittis. Judy, I'm going to unmute you. Hi, Judy. Do you have a question, Judy? Comment?
Yeah, my last name is actually Didis, but anyway, I have a question, Scott, about that. I guess you do astrocartography. That's implied here. Yes. Is that how you chose your current place of living, through astrocartography?
Well, actually, that's a really great question. And actually, what happened was that there are a number of places around the world that are really good for anybody. And when we know where those places are and when we travel to them, I first traveled to Germany 12 years ago. Basically, on this day 12 years ago, we were in Germany for September 11, 2001. And what happened when we came here was two things. Number one, we discovered we loved the location. Number two, I discovered some really interesting past life themes here through real characters from past lives that I'm very strongly connected to. And it also turns out that this is one of these places that is very, very potent for me. So the answer is that it happened because we traveled here, we liked it, we felt the energies from astrocartography, but actually there are three systems: astrocartography, geodetic, and local space. And in my chart, all three of these systems point about 50 miles north of here and make a great big X in the sky. And it really sort of said, Scott, you have to come here. And my wife Sappho has great energy here too. So it really hit on all these different levels.
All right, thank you very much.
Great story.
Anybody else, if you want to make a comment or speak to Scott, just on the attendees panel, you can click the hand box beside your name, and I will unmute you. If Leroy, can you look in the questions box? I just sent you a message that somehow I cancel out my questions area.
Are you chatting or are we messaged? Okay, you lost your questions pane.
Yeah, I have the chat, but I lost my questions pane, and I don't know how I get it back.
Just some comments on a most excellent presentation for you, Scott, as always, and it was a nice remembrance of and thanks for stating that you were indeed Evolutionary Astrology Network's first graduate of our multimedia course. So we are just, I guess proud parents over here, proud as peacocks for sure.
I love it. I love it. Well, you guys are just the best, and thanks to you and to everybody who was listening today. I had a fun time.
Oh, great, great. So, anybody else, comments or questions? Any final things from you, Scott?
I think I'm all talked out. That's hard to imagine, but I'm kind of all talked out.
Well, let's let that be the last word then for the day. I'm gonna go ahead.
Judy has one more comment. I'm gonna unmute Judy. Judy, you're unmuted.
Yes. So you said that the Grand Cross is a slow acting transit. However, the Mars part and the Jupiter part, well, the Mars part is not slow. That moves pretty quickly, doesn't it?
Yes. And
so what's the slow part is the Uranus and the Pluto square.
Judy, this is absolutely right. So let me explore this for you a little bit. Uranus and Pluto want and demand evolutionary structural reform over a period of time. What the Grand Cross is a time when there is specific, unique tension that is available for all of us to engage with. So when we use this particular period, we can take actions that we can't take at other times. However, there is one more way to look at this, which is that there are also transits of the planets to your chart. So what we can say is, when does Mars make important transits to planets in your chart? So you might say, when does Mars conjunct the Sun, trine Jupiter, conjunct Jupiter? There's lots of different variations. But what we're looking for is times when we can energize our actions. And the Grand Cross is one of those times that's there for everybody. But we also have our own individual versions of key transits that we also want to look for on our own. So when we identify both the timing of the Grand Cross, it says here's a time of action that we can take, but there are also other points in time, which means that what we get to do is to say, what we're not going to do is, as let's just say, what if all 101 of us were going to say, what do we have to do on the day of the Grand Cross? Well, really it doesn't work quite that way. What we want to do is to say, if we're ready for next chapter of life is meant to look like. If we are ready to take that first next step, the Grand Cross date is one of those key dates that can really help us. But again, it's not the only one that we have to work with. So again, we all have the Grand Cross, but then we all also have our own individual transits, and we want to work with all of it because they're all here to help us. So the question just is knowing what it is that next step might be, what is the time frame in which you're ready to take it, and then to be prepared to take action on one of the appropriate dates. One thing that we actually kind of don't want to do is we don't want to say, let's say you're writing a book and you want to publish that book and there's a nice connection in your chart to the Grand Cross. But you say, my book's not going to be ready until the summer of 2014, maybe the beginning of 2015. Don't try to publish the book during the energy of the Grand Cross. Wait for the right time. Wait for when you're ready. And then we take action using the astrology to help us move forward. Does that make sense, Judy?
I've got Judy muted, so hold on just a second. I'll have to unmute her. And Vicki, I recognize you have your hand raised as well, honey. You're next. Judy, you're unmuted.
Yes, absolutely. I hear what you're saying. I have the Jupiter is on my Venus, and the Mars will be on my Neptune, so that'll be interesting. Of the Grand Cross, the Jupiter will be on my Venus, and the Mars will be on my Neptune. But yes, I hear what you're saying. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, thanks for the question.
Should we take a final question from Victoria, Kim?
Yes, and Leroy, either you or I are running this board because I mute, you unmute. So I need you to mute Judy back. You've taken it over, Leroy. I can't mute Judy.
Technology.
I know. And
technology
Leroy,
is.
Yeah, somehow, Leroy, you have taken over everything from me, and when I click, nothing's happening. So, and I think I might have just lost Mr. Leroy. So, okay, Vicki, it looks like you are unmuted, honey. Vicki, can you speak? All right, do I have you, Scott?
Yes, I'm still here.
While Leroy's working this board, Victoria, Miss Vicki, if you can try and speak. It looks like you're unmuted. Do you have any of your instruments muted? One of the things I was grasping from Jupiter and Cancer as I was listening to you is the visionary work of Jupiter when it moves through Cancer is of a feeling nature. It's how the emotional body feels to looking at something into the future rather than getting this great flash of where we're going to be sometimes.
Feelings are really key with the energy of Cancer. And for me, I have transiting Jupiter was conjunct my Sun about 2 weeks ago. And so I have a 12th house Cancer Sun. So whatever I do with my Sun, the way that I shine as an individual, it has to honor my feelings. And what Jupiter does when he comes across that and energizes that, which I'm really lucky because he's going to do it 3 times, what happens is that it gives insights and opportunities and visions with regard to how that feeling is meant to come forward, how it is meant to move into the future. The Jupiter is always pointing us to the future, but yeah, it definitely has this connection to our feelings and our needs to honor those emotions. Absolutely, and I think it does that, and I think this is it's a great note.
I think I can unmute Vicki now. Vicki, try again. Miss Victoria? Well, anyway, she did do some typing for us. Oh, she doesn't know if she has a microphone. So let's see what Vicky has written here. And it looks like, hold on a second here. Here it is. Okay. Besides my life work being challenged, is there another perspective on having your son being hit? Vicky was born on July 3rd, so she definitely has the sun in Cancer and in that Grand Cross. So again, Scott, her question is, besides my life's work being challenged, is there another perspective on having your son being hit by this Jupiter in Cancer?
The answer is absolutely. And by the way, I love this because that's my birthday as well. I'm July 3rd, as exact same day. Really, the key here is to go back and look at the cycles and chapters of life, see what's been unfolding, and watch to see if there's any pressure in your life for change. Now, there's one thing that I didn't really say and bring out in any particular way, but there are times when, if we are honoring the birth chart, if we're embracing our dharma, the Wookiee might leave us alone. You know, not everybody has to go through a rebirth at this time. If you're already doing it, what you'll find is that some of your gifts will get deeper, but it really becomes this question of, it can be with regard to purpose in life. It can really go in any direction. The key is, are you experiencing any elements of pressure where you're feeling like, boy, something as big is up, something has to happen? Try to identify that. If it's not, then ask, what is it about me that's meant to get deeper? What's meant to come out? What's meant to become more radiant? And I think that we can look at this in both of these two, from these different perspectives. In a sense, say, we can either change to do what is more appropriate for us, or we can embrace the part that is emerging, that is the next phase, so to speak. But again, it can take place in any part of life. And one of the things that we would do, of course, is, you know, you'd look at your entire birth chart, you'd see the whole structure of it. Where is the sun? Your 11-degree Cancer sun, where does that go? And then what's the rest of the chart look like? And again, what are you experiencing in your life? And then really read it from there. So I think that's the way that I would look at that. For me personally, I feel like with the changes that I've made in my life over the last 12 years, that what I'm feeling is this need for new, deeper things to come out. In one sense, nothing will change, but it's almost as if there's one more way to look at this, which is, you know, sometimes the caterpillar is sitting on a leaf and is doing very well, and he recognizes that it's time to go into the cocoon so it can come out a butterfly, emerge as a butterfly. And what we want to do is to sort of put these different themes together and see which version works for us. The hardest part to this is that, so we want to understand, where is he grunting at us? Where is he pointing? Where do we seem to feel a disturbance? And that's really the direction that I would go. Thanks. That's a fabulous question.
Let me see. Vicky's saying thank you. And oh, yeah. All right, Scott, one more comment. I think it was a Therese who said that you're just great at taking ancient mythology, moving it through the lens of EA, and giving us practical applications as an individual, as I paraphrase a little bit here. And then we have one other question. Mary is wanting to know about Chiron's role in astrocartography.
Chiron's role in astrocartography. Well, that's a fabulous question. And what happens is that, okay, when we look at Chiron in myth, Chiron is known as kind of the wounded healer. I look at him through a mythic lens in a little different way. Chiron is abandoned the day he's born. His father Saturn abandons him, his mother abandons him, and he's raised by the gods Apollo and Diana. And they give him all kinds of wisdom, and he becomes the teacher of all the healers, of all the seers, of all the warriors, of all the kings. He teaches everybody. And at the same time, what he's here to teach us is that there is something that moves us to a more complicated world. He moves us beyond Saturn to Uranus and the outer planets. So when we translate this into astrocartography and the geodetic maps, what happens is this Chiron energies are where we will feel both being abandoned and wounded in ways that are unfair in some way, but that also bring forward our new capacity to be a person of wisdom. So one thing that happens is we feel those unfairnesses, we recognize a new level of wisdom, and then we also have the opportunity to share that wisdom. Now, in this regard, one of the things that happens is that particularly shamans are really, really strong with going to Chiron energies. And at the same time, so shamans, healers, some degree of teachers will gravitate towards these energies. But again, they're more about feeling that need to be the person of wisdom and to work through the unfairness that's naturally a part of the world. You know, when we see a yin-yang symbol, there's always a dot of white in the black and a dot of black in the white. There's nothing that's perfect. Chiron wants us to let go of all of this notion of perfection and recognize that there is unfairness in the world, but there's also wisdom. And Chiron locations can help us to pull that together. That's a cool question.
That was a good question. Thank you.
And for what it's worth, Kid Marie, I lived on geodetic Chiron when I lived in Los Angeles, and there was both a lot of wisdom that I gained there, but also I ended up with being, in a sense, wounded or treated unfairly. And it's amazing how these myths. The biggest thing is it's so cool to see how the myths come forward in real life, particularly when we're living on the energies. So.
Scott, I don't know if you know this. I live on my Uranus line, Uranus on the 7th house. And I've lived on this line all my life except for 1 year. So for that, can we live on Uranus lines? Yeah. And I look at it as all the metamorphic change or Uranus transformative change I've made from my little farm girl, to doing evolutionary astrology like this.
Isn't it great that both change and astrology are connected to Uranus, and you're living it? I lived on that when we lived in Iowa. I was living exactly on my Uranus ascendant energy, and that's where a lot of my uniqueness sort of took off in unexpected ways. So yeah, these Uranus energies are great, and you've done obviously a fabulous job. You've contributed a lot to my world, that's for sure.
Thank you.